The dust settled on the wagon tracks, clinging to everything, to the rough wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, to the dry air catching in her throat, to the silence that pressed heavier than any mountain. Nara did not look back at the riders who had brought her here, nor did she look forward at the man who stood framed in the cabin doorway, a stark, unfamiliar silhouette against the setting sun. Her people had exchanged her for peace, a fragile promise etched in hurried words and uncertain glances. She was the object of the treaty, the unwanted bridge across a chasm of mistrust and spilled blood. He was called Ethan. His name felt foreign on her tongue, a hard, clipped sound with no echo of the land. He was tall, lean as a winter coyote, his face weathered and unreadable under the brim of a worn hat. His cabin was small, made of rough-hewn logs, squatting low on the desolate land like a forgotten stone. Inside, it was even more stark, a dirt floor, a rough table, a single chair, a narrow cot covered with a threadbare blanket. The air held the scent of wood smoke and something else, something metallic and distant, like sadness. He stepped aside, a silent gesture that was not quite an invitation, merely an allowance. Nara hesitated for only a breath, then walked past him, her deerskin moccasins making no sound on the hard ground. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the shifting weight of his feet outside. She stood in the center of the room, a prisoner in a cage she could not see, only feel pressing in on her from all sides. The vulnerability was a raw wound. She had been stripped of her people, her name in its true form, her future as she had imagined it. She was chattel, exchanged for a hope she did not share, burdened with a task she did not understand. Hours bled into one another. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges that mocked the bleakness in her heart. He came inside eventually, carrying a pail of water and a small plate with dry bread and something that smelled like jerky. He placed it on the table without a word, his movements economical and quiet. He did not look directly at her. This lack of directness, this absence of gaze, felt like another form of erasure. She was not worth looking at, perhaps, or perhaps looking would acknowledge her in a way he was not prepared to do. He sat by the small fireplace, adding a few pieces of wood. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows that made the cabin seem larger, more menacing. Nara watched him from the corner of her eye. His hands were calloused, strong. He seemed accustomed to solitude, to the quiet work of surviving. He was an unknown, an enemy given the shape of a husband. The thought curdled in her stomach. Husband. The word was a violation. She ate the bread slowly, each bite a struggle against the dryness in her mouth and the knot of fear in her gut. The jerky tasted alien, salted and cured in a way her people did not use. Everything here was alien. She curled herself onto the cot when he finally lay down on a pallet near the fire, wrapping the thin blanket tightly around her. Sleep was a distant country, unreachable across the desert of her sorrow and fear. The night outside was vast and silent, holding its breath alongside her. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle. Sun rose, casting long, pale shadows. Sun beat down, making the air shimmer. Sun set, plunging the world into cold, vast darkness. Ethan spoke little, his words clipped and functional. Water, firewood, eat. Nara responded with gestures or silence. She learned his rhythms. He left before dawn to check snares or ride the perimeter, returned mid-morning, worked on gear or the cabin, left again in the afternoon, came back as dusk fell. His movements were deliberate, efficient. He was not cruel. He did not strike her or confine her beyond the isolation of this place. But neither was he kind. He was simply present, a silent, watchful sentinel. From her perspective, he remained an enigma. What thoughts lay behind those guarded eyes? Did he resent her presence as much as she resented being here? Was he merely following orders? Or was there some flicker of hope for this peace in him? She saw him mend a torn saddle with careful stitches, patiently work a piece of wood into a handle, sit for long periods simply watching the horizon. He seemed rooted in this harsh soil, surviving against the odds, much like the few resilient plants that pushed through the dry earth. Slowly, tentatively, Nara began to exist within the space rather than just occupy it. She noticed the dust gathering thick on the table and began to sweep it with a bundle of twigs she fashioned. She saw the water pail empty and, after a hesitant moment, picked it up and walked to the nearby spring he used. Ethan watched these actions but said nothing. His silence was not approval or disapproval, just observation. It was unnerving, yet less frightening than outright hostility. She started small fires in the morning before he returned, just enough to take the chill off the air. She cleaned the few tin plates. She did not do these things out of wifely duty. The concept was a bitter joke here, but because the cabin was her space too now, however unwanted. And perhaps a deeper, unspoken reason. It was something to do, something that asserted her existence beyond being a mere object of exchange. It was a small act of reclaiming dignity in a situation designed to strip her of it. One evening, a cold wind blew hard from the north. The small fire struggled. Nara shivered, pulling the thin blanket tighter. Ethan was silent for a long moment, then rose and added several larger pieces of wood to the flames. He did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the fire. It was a small act, practical and necessary, but it was the first time he had seemed to respond to her physical discomfort. It wasn't kindness, not in the way she understood it, but it was something. A concession to their shared vulnerability against the indifferent elements. A tiny crack appeared in the wall of his reserve, or perhaps, in her perception of it. The vast silence between them remained, but for a moment, it felt less like an empty void and more like a space holding unspoken questions. The fragile quiet of their existence was shattered by the distant sound of hoofbeats, too many and too fast for a lone rider. Ethan tensed, his hand going instinctively to the rifle leaning against the wall. Nara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Visitors were rare, unexpected. Who would come here to this isolated place with such urgency? The sound grew louder, closer, a thunderous rhythm against the hard earth. Ethan moved quickly, extinguishing the fire with a practiced sweep of dirt, plunging the cabin into near darkness save for the thin light filtering through the small window. He motioned for Nara to move away from the window, towards the back wall, his eyes sharp and alert. His silence now was not indifference, but focused caution. It was a different kind of language, one of shared danger. The riders burst into the small clearing outside, silhouetted against the pale sky. They were men from her own people, but not those who had brought her here in peace. Their faces, hard and grim in the fading light, were twisted with a cold anger. They carried rifles, not peace offerings. Nara's blood ran cold. This was not a friendly visit. One of them shouted Ethan's name, the sound harsh and accusatory in the quiet air. "They say you tricked us, paleface," the voice yelled in broken English, laced with Navajo. "You promised peace, but you plot against us. This woman was a lie, a spy." Betrayal. The word hung in the air, heavy with venom. Not betrayal between her and Ethan, but a betrayal perceived by others, aimed at their fragile, unwanted union. This marriage, meant to be a symbol of peace, had become a flashpoint, a target for those who sought conflict. And Nara, the bridge, was caught in the middle, accused of being something she was not, her very presence here weaponized by forces beyond her control. She felt a wave of nausea, betrayed by her own people, used as an excuse for violence. Ethan did not respond to the shouts immediately. He moved silently to the window, peering out cautiously. His face was grim, his jaw set. He looked less like a stoic figure now, more like a cornered animal, dangerous and ready to defend himself. Nara watched him, a strange mix of fear and something else churning within her. Fear for her life, certainly, but also a dawning realization. He was not abandoning her. He was preparing to face this threat, a threat brought to his door because of her. The shouting outside escalated into demands. Demands that Ethan come out, that he answer for his supposed treachery, that he hand over the woman. The air crackled with tension. This was the real danger, not the silent isolation or the wary truce within the cabin, but the violent world outside that refused to leave them alone. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low and steady, directed at Nara but carrying the weight of his decision. Stay back. Don't make a sound. It wasn't gentle, but it was protective. In that moment, the wall between them seemed to crack further, revealing not just a man bound by circumstance, but a man choosing to stand his ground. The confrontation erupted. Shots rang out, deafening in the small cabin. Ethan moved with surprising speed and agility, a blur in the dim light. He fired back through narrow gaps, his movements precise and deadly. Nara huddled against the wall, her heart pounding, the sounds of violence a terrifying symphony around her. She could hear the shouts of the attackers, the thud of hooves, the splintering of wood as a bullet struck the cabin wall near her head. Terror was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. But amidst the panic, she watched Ethan. He was calm, focused, a hunter protecting his den. He was not the indifferent figure she had perceived. He was capable, resourceful. He was fighting for his life, yes, but he was also fighting because she was here. The realization was stark and profound. He had not sought this conflict, but he was facing it head-on, defending the fragile bubble of their forced existence. The attack was fierce but relatively brief. The attackers, perhaps wary of a prolonged fight or realizing they faced more resistance than expected, eventually retreated, their shouts fading into the distance, leaving behind only the ringing silence and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The cabin was scarred, a few bullet holes marring the logs, but it held. They had survived. In the aftermath, the silence returned, but it was different now. It was filled with the echo of violence, the lingering scent of danger, and the heavy weight of shared experience. Ethan lowered his rifle, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked towards Nara, his eyes meeting hers across the dim space. It was the first time he had truly looked at her, not just glanced or observed, but met her gaze directly. His expression was weary, etched with the adrenaline of the fight, but there was something else there too, a flicker of acknowledgement, of shared vulnerability. He did not speak for a long moment. Nara did not move from the wall. The air was thick with unspoken words. The peace treaty had been a piece of paper, easily threatened by the hatred and suspicion that still festered. Her presence here had been a gamble, and it had nearly cost them everything. But through the fire of the attack, something unexpected had been forged. Not understanding, not affection, but a grudging, vital bond born of facing death together. Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice rough. They won't come back tonight. It was a simple statement of fact, yet it carried the weight of a promise of temporary safety. Nara nodded, unable to find her voice. He walked over to where she sat, not close enough to touch, but closer than he had ever been. He extended his hand, not towards her, but towards the wall where a bullet had struck near her. He traced the splintered wood with a calloused finger. He did not say, "Are you hurt?" or "Are you afraid?" but the gesture spoke volumes. Nara looked at his hand, then back at his face. The fear had not vanished entirely, but it was tempered by a burgeoning sense of resilience. She had been delivered here an object, a sacrifice. She had lived in silence and fear, but she had also observed, adapted, and now she had faced death alongside this man. She was still here. She was not broken. Peace, she realized, was not given. It had to be built painstakingly, sometimes in the most unlikely of places, between the most unlikely of people. It was not the absence of conflict, but the strength to stand together when conflict inevitably came. Their marriage was not a fairy tale, nor was it the simple transaction her people had intended. It was a shared existence forged in the crucible of the wilderness and the fire of external hate. The future remained uncertain, a vast, harsh landscape stretching before them. But as Ethan stood there, quietly inspecting the scar on the wall left by the attack meant for them both, Nara felt a subtle shift within her. She was no longer just a woman delivered for peace. She was a woman who had survived the breaking of it, standing on scarred ground, not alone, but alongside the man who had become her reluctant partner in survival. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt less like a prison sentence and more like a path they might, somehow walk together.